Welcome to Cross Section, conversations at the intersection of faith, news, and culture. We are excited to be on YouTube. Please subscribe to the Evangelical Alliance YouTube channel to never miss an episode. On today's episode, we have a meandering conversation covering different topics, from Love is Blind to a TikTok influencer's decision to open a women-only gym space, and ending on what the role of Christian is in housing policy. Enjoy the episode.
Well, hello and welcome to Season 10, Episode 7. Every time I say that, I say, why does anybody else care about that? We do, maybe. But here, the exciting bit is we are all in a studio together.
We are.
We're in London. We're in our new snazzy dazzy studio. I'll be ripped for saying that afterwards, won't I? Anyway, if you're on YouTube, you can see that we're all together. This is very exciting. If you're on the podcast, you'll say, what's the difference? I can just hear you all. But there might be a bit more riffing and banter because we're all in the same space together. And we are starting with an unusual first story, which somebody's going to tell me that I pitched that this was a good idea. Love is Blind. First question is, does anybody listen to this podcast watch Love is Blind?
Well, I don't. I've had a quick catch up. Googled a few stories, watched a couple of clips.
What is Love is Blind, Alicia?
Oh, I don't know why
As
you're
the
looking
watcher.
at me. I've got no clue
Come
why you're looking at
on.
me. I think the premise is it's a show on Netflix for which, it's all in the title. People are looking for love, marriage. I have no idea.
Do you want me to actually tell you what
Yeah,
happens?
tell us what
Blind
it
date
is.
gone
It's
nuts.
such a
So
blind
you have
date.
15 guys, 15 women, and they go on a series of pod dates when they can't see each other. They can talk to each other. They can play board games, do whatever they like. And then at the end of that process, they can choose whether or not they want to get engaged to someone. And if couples match up, they then meet in person, I think go off on a group holiday, and then some of them end up getting married or
Right, so this
nearly
is
married.
like this is like the old Cilla Black.
No. Scylla Black
Gone
blind dates
on-
was what it was about. I'm not quite sure.
Hyped up. This
I'm not
is
sure
it
this
gone
is
mad.
quite it,
So
but
why
anyway.
the reason we are talking about this, Danny?
So one of the
you seem
couples.
best informed.
Well, yeah, based on my extensive research. One of the couples got to the altar and she ditched him. And it was all a bit confused. She talks about how much she loves him and everything about him, and then basically says, your values and your views are things that I can't support and I wouldn't want, particularly his approach to Black Lives Matter, but also she had been looking at some sermons online of his church, which take a traditional position on sexuality. And then in the post-interview, it would seem he was a bit evasive about whether he knew about that or not.
Well, the clip I said he didn't seem to know that they had a position. So the basic premise that they weren't getting married is because she didn't think that they shared values.
Yeah.
That's a good idea, that if you don't share values, you shouldn't get married, but they have to do it at the altar. And then he didn't seem to understand his values. We're not sure if he's a Christian, he's a church attending person,
It would seem.
but he didn't seem to know what his own church thought about some key issues.
Probably not. But I think one of the things is that this does tap into questions about kind of church identity, particularly in the US. A lot of people will be affiliated or associated with churches, but not necessarily have the same level of agreement with beliefs. We've seen that in surveys where people have wide-ranging beliefs. But he was happy to go on Love is Blind, which I think is a interesting choice.
Whereas one of the shifts here in the UK is that for younger people, if they do go to church, they're much more likely to be fully engaged and actually believe. There's no more nominalism amongst the younger generation. So we're waiting for more stats and surveys in this, but stuff that I've read is that younger generation are passionate about their faith. If they have a faith,
Yeah.
there are less of them have it, but if they have it, they're passionate about it, and they're passionate to share about it, and they really believe and are kind of all in on it in a different way. I think we might have done Love is Blind. That might be it. Do you have anything else profound to say on
Well,
Love is
no,
Blind,
I guess
Alicia?
that the overall question, or talking about how does faith inform our dating relationships. Now, would you go on Love is Blind? That's acceptable. You two won't because you're happily married. But for those that are single, the question of how do you find a spouse is a question in itself, and whether you think about actually, if faith is going to be central to a marriage, which I highly would recommend, then actually a lot of the conversations about dating, about, family life, future, how much is Jesus in the center of our decision making, I think just as an observer looking at it, I think it's a case in point of being clear about how much faith informs life decisions rather than just a theological idea and him not knowing where his church is at. I think I think the culture is demanding quite a lot in terms of Christians, what do you actually believe? And it's an opportunity for us to lean into those spaces and articulate why our position on marriage, sexuality, why are they framed in biblical values, and how does that then play out that isn't, which I saw some people describe him as homophobic, transphobic, etc., because of his church's teaching.
Do you think a Christian should go on Love is Blind or shouldn't?
I mean, I personally probably wouldn't give counsel to that because of the platform, and it's looking to kind of create, well, the end goal, it's trying to create a space for people to eventually fall in love. But how true, if you're saying by the conversations that happened, it's at the end that they're questioning key values, I don't think that's a healthy dating relationship.
I'm not sure. The goal is entertainment.
Again.
The goal is a good TV show. And I think Christians can meet and form relationships in all sorts of different contexts, and they could do it on a TV show. But it's an uphill struggle in this kind of context because it is geared towards drama, geared towards entertainment, geared towards the sensationalism. And that's going to be a challenge.
Yes, I think it's madness to go as a Christian on such a show, but that's maybe because I'm old. The whole dating apps thing, that's a whole other episode. That'd be fascinating to talk more about. I can't even get my head around that. But there we go. We might talk about that at another time. So we've talked about Love is Blind. We started there. I don't know who pitched that story, but they should be fired immediately. I think that was probably me, trying to be culturally relevant. Then a little update on assisted suicide, because it is another big story that actually is getting a lot of coverage in the press, and rightly so. I think a shout out to Danny Kruger, who does appear to be doing a one-man opposition at the moment. And the reason for that is because the committee is stacked 13-8, so it's only the committee doing the hearing, it's not the whole of Parliament. And of those 8, he is one of the ones with the most experience. He's not the only one, to be fair. There's a Labour MP, Naz Shah, who's doing a good job, and some of the others are, but they're basically trying to almost tire them out, because Kim Leadbeater's side are just going yes, no, short answers, and forcing those opposing the bill in general and bringing the amendments to try and change it to do all the work. And they're now talking about sitting into the night. So, Alicia, I'm looking at you for a little bit more of a technical update on where we are. But fundamentally, lots and lots of these amendments have been kicked back, and they are trying to tire out.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're in committee stage. From next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, MPs will be sitting twice a day, I think 9 till 1, and then it's 2 till 10 p.m. to, in theory, scrutinise the bill, but as you rightly say, not much scrutiny is going to be taking place. If you're watching the sessions, which you possibly are not, a lot of the conversations that are coming up around trying to bring clarity in the legislation. Yesterday, the biggest significant change that has had a real strong pushback is that the bill sponsor, Kim Leadbeater, has removed the High Court judge that was in kind of its second reading, that was the main hook for many new members of Parliament in thinking about accountability, in thinking of safeguards, and what she's put in its place is the role of a kind of an assisted dying commissioner, which is an appointed role, and then an assisted dying review panel, which is what's going to be discussed next week, which is made up of 3 kind of specialisms of either law or kind of psychiatry or social work to review whether the person requesting an assisted death fits the criteria and all as well. But again, there's not much scrutiny. There's no expectation that there would be dialogue with the patient. There's no expectation that the doctor would feed in kind of medical assessment of what's going on. So that's what's
no subpoena powers. So a lot of judicial authority, similar to a judge, but they don't have the same responsibility and accountability. And everything I've read, they can't be pushed back on in the same way. And they don't have power of subpoena to pull in any witnesses who they think might be relevant on this. So,
and I think Danny Kruger said that he had low expectations for the committee improving the bill, but what he didn't expect was it to get even worse, and that's what we've seen this week.
Yeah, so every turn, in our view, this has been watered down to keep this, if you like, the kind of simple overview at every turn, every sensible amendment that required higher thresholds, higher scrutiny. You know, even I think if somebody is given the drugs, they won't answer the question as to what happens if those drugs fail for some reason. Danny Kruger, again, rightly asking, are you legally obliged to carry this through and essentially end somebody's life to take action? Are you legally obliged to resuscitate them and bring them back and start again, if you like? Or are you legally obliged to do nothing? And basically, they couldn't answer the question because, again, scrutiny's not there. Even if you're for this, to be crystal clear, we think this bill is a total disaster in the way it's being run through. And I'm going to say for me, I'm also somewhat skeptical or suspicious as to how exactly it's been driven. There's a lot of government time and effort being put in behind the scenes to get it to where it is. There's work being done behind the scenes.
The kind of engagement of the government with it is just not clear, because there's 2 government ministers on the committee who are pretty much voting with the bill sponsor all the time.
That's Kinnock Jr. I mean, he's a disaster. He's a healthcare minister. Let's be very clear. His engagement, this has been rubbish.
But also, there's some suggestion that the changes from High Court judges came at the government's prompting because of fears about capacity of the judicial system. There's been a bit of dispute over exactly what prompted it. So there's definitely been some engagement from government about it, but it's kind of happening behind the scenes, because the government are thinking, well, this is the legitimate point, I think. They're thinking, well, if this is coming into law, we want a law that at least will work. I think that's a reasonable point, but that's kind of happening behind the scenes. And then at the same time, you've got these 2 ministers voting in favour of it at every turn.
So 2 things I would say. This is coming back at the end of April. At the minute, it's scheduled to come out 25th. 28th.
Yes,
20 something.
Late April. It has to come back on the 25th.
It has to come back
because that's the private members' bill date. If it misses that date,
which is why they're driving all this through. But that will be, Danny, I'm looking to you, a pretty much straight up or down vote on it at that stage.
There will be both report where they will vote on the report from the committee, and then a 3rd reading stage. So there will be opportunities for further amendments, and then after those amendments, there will be a straight up and down vote, and that will be more or less the final vote in the House of Commons on this bill.
And we will be keeping you informed as to when that's coming, because that is a right to the MP moment. Because the gap here was about 50 MPs, so we need to see 25 plus MPs change their votes, or some of those who didn't vote or abstain changing. And a number have indicated that some of the things we've been talking about were very crucial to them voting for it, like the High Court safeguard, or that they were voting to see it unfold further, and it has got worse. So it will be a big drive to vote to write your MP. But the other thing is, again, personally, and I think you guys share this, I think there's total darkness around this. I think this is a spiritual battleground. This is deeply dark, what is being proposed, and the kind of changes that we're talking one of the biggest social, moral, ethical changes in my lifetime. The Northern Ireland abortion is the other thing I think on a par. The scale of what this will mean in terms of lives impacted. And we're seeing it in Canada and what did happen there. So let's be crystal clear that we need to be praying into this and speaking out about this. This is massive, which is why we'll go from time to time, we'll bring it back up and keep people informed. It's not, again, our key story today. I'm not sure. Danny,
I don't think we do have a key
Danny
story
has
today.
pitched, people, we've kept it to the end, but Danny has pitched a planning story, but he thinks it's going to save the day, but we're not there yet. We're not there. So Love is Blind into assisted suicide, and seamlessly, we are going to a female gym owner, Natalie Barnett, who has been attacked online for banning trans women from her gym. Don't think there's any faith element to this story. This, for me, is a little bit about the cultural shift, because when she first went fundraising 4 years ago, she said yes. Somebody asked her a question. I think she said yes, you could come in if you were a trans woman. So if you were born male, identified as female, you could. And now that she's kind of raised the money and got the gym just about up and running, she has said, no, this is a space only for biological women. Alyssa, you've had a little look at this story.
Yeah, I have. No, and it's a UK story. So the idea is that the gym would open in Wandsworth. And I think the challenge or the pushback that has come from is the integrity of fundraising. One moment you held a position that was potentially popular in the cultural debate, that trans women are women. She said that as part of her fundraiser. And then time has elapsed and maybe the conversation, or there has been a vibe shift, but also for her, she talks about her own personal story of experiencing sexual harassment within a gym context. And so for her, she's gone through a journey of being I want to create a space whereby a gym is a single sex space that is safe for women. And actually there has been a rise of sexual harassment within a gym context. And so that has been her main push and kind of call to kind of shift her position and say that this is a single sex biological space. And of course, J.K. Rowling came out and supported that. And that's probably elevated some of the pushback that she's receiving ahead of her launch.
Does she really have 70 million TikTok followers?
Yes, she does.
I haven't checked.
That's insane.
I don't
Somebody
have a
wrote that
TikTok account.
down. Oh yeah, Danny, you forgot to check your TikTok before you come in. How could you? Danny?
Well, I think it seems like within the law, she's entitled. The Equality and Human Rights Commission have clarified that single-sex spaces can be defined on the basis of biological sex. I think there's a legitimate question about the integrity of raising money with one position and then delivering something else. I wonder if there will be some demands that people who pledge money under a certain approach might want their money back, which I think is a legitimate challenge to her, that she said one thing and changed her mind. I think she should be free to do what she's wanting to do, and hopefully won't cause her too much trouble. Maybe with her 70 million TikTok followers, it won't cause that much of a problem, but we'll see.
There are a couple of cases going on around this. There's Wings, I think it's Wings Over Scotland have a case before the Supreme Court a little bit. It's definitely connected to this. And then there's the nurse Peggy. This is in Scotland again. She's in Fife, I believe. And this is where Dr. Upton, born male identifying as female, came into the changing area and she objected. So again, and Fife were saying at the time that the NHS Trust in Fife were saying that they couldn't stop this person doing that if that's the way they identified. But there has been this clarification that actually single-sex spaces are allowed based on biology. And then the Darlington nurses, I think, falls into a fairly similar bracket. That's another case in the background. So these are cases we may pick up on. While I think the legal bit of that is interesting, I think I agree with both of you. It's the vibe shift that she was on message 4 years ago, which was to allow a trans woman in. She is now on message in the new vibe, I would say, to say, no, she's not. But that cultural shift is really interesting. It's something we are observing across the board. It was going to be close to a Trump-free zone. I've now mentioned the name. We'll not go in there right now. Who knows what's happening in Ukraine? By the time this goes out, I mean, there's lots of talk about deals being done. But again, that's part of this bigger vibe shift as to what's going on and what's happening out there. You can email us. You could email me and explain how my phone is on airplane mode and you heard it ringing potentially there at Mystifies Me. So that'd be a really helpful personal thing you can tell me about. You can get in touch with us on socials. Danny thinks he has the answer to that. Not now, Danny, not now. You can tell me afterwards where I went wrong. So you can get in touch with us at cross.section@eauk.org. All over that. You can follow us on personal socials. I think that's just Danny and I. Lissy is very wise and doesn't go on social media. Shout out to Rob. Rob's our newest listener. We just heard about Rob. So I hope you're listening to this episode. Rob will be very disappointed. Do get in touch. We do actually read the emails from time to time and, we pull them into the show. We're all over the social side. With that, Danny, you have pitched that you think the most important thing that we should be talking about as we almost come to a peace deal in Ukraine and Russia, maybe, who knows, is the biggest building boom in a generation and changes to planning and infrastructure laws. Because here's the reality. Homes, houses, where we live, the roof over our head is actually the thing that voters care about.
Yep. So I'm not sure it's the most important thing for us to talk about, but I think it's one of the most important things in domestic politics over the next 5 years is whether the government are able to deliver on their pledge to build 1.5 million homes. And with that, the economic growth that would come, there's a lot of their economic plans are based on being able to deliver both homes and other infrastructure improvements and the growth that will come with that. So actually being able to do this is really important. But I think it poses us a question, and I think this is why I wanted us to talk about it, is what is a Christian approach to this? What is a Christian approach to planning policy, infrastructure policy? Christians have been at the forefront of tackling homelessness. There are Christian charities, member organizations that work housing people coming out of substance or alcohol misuse, doing an amazing job with some quite innovative housing approaches. But if we look back at our history, Christians really have been at the forefront of social housing, housing development, whether that's through businesses like Cadbury's, Fry, Guinness, Peabody, or kind of social reformers. It's a really significant part of Christian heritage in the UK, the work that's been done around housing. But actually, do we have anything to say about it today? When we look at 187 planning and infrastructure bill, is there something that, as Christians, we can have a distinct perspective on? Or do we just think, it's a technocratic thing and we'll leave it to everyone else to go on with?
Well, Alyssa, you promised to stay awake for this discussion. we all promised. We're in for planning and infrastructure.
Do you know what? At the start, I was probably cynical, but then I think about my local church community, and one of my deepest frustrations is the high street is absolutely derelict. The buildings are either boarded up and have a mix of either quite literally demonic spray painting, graffiti, or it's been used as kind of vandalism and places for drug dealing. And I think there is churches are, and the Christian community is spread over all different types of community, from rural, coastal, inner city to suburban. And I think we should be equally concerned about what is the infrastructure of our town that provides human flourishing, that provides for families, that provides and somewhat establishes a community where people don't just live in their individual houses but never come together. And I think there's a level of envisioning that actually churches and Christians can contribute to the conversation. I think the expertise is probably something to develop within Christian communities. There are many that are, I think there was a conversation in the office yesterday of how kind of developers, Christians, kind of business leaders have come together and are into developing. I think that'd be amazing on scale. How can the church support at a local level? So I think there's a level of envisioning, but I think the challenge that the government have is that they would want a standardized blueprint for the whole of the UK in terms of how the housing is built. And I don't think that's actually realistic. And I don't think that solves problems at a local level. So I think the church needs to definitely engage in this, and particularly when the decision making comes that the government's going to bypass local authorities in order to take over land and say this is going to be built, even if you're saying you don't want it to be. I think there's a role for the church to speak about how does that impact at a local level. So yeah.
So I actually wrote my dissertation at Bible College on housing policy.
So why are you dismissing the story?
Well, I think it's critically important. I think the Old Testament laws around Jubilee, Sabbath, gleaning laws are all about stake in the land, and it's really important. But that stake in the land there was about work, because your land was where you worked. It was about inheritance and family. It was about the roof over your head, the place to live. It was a lot around identity as well. So it brought together so many parts of that. And one of the things that the Jubilee laws were saying is that you had to do the reset every 50 years because it was so important that everybody had a stake in the land and had the ability and the right to those things, to be able to work and to pass things through the generations. That you had this kind of reset moment continually. So I think the Bible does have a lot to say. There's good discussion and debate as to exactly what that looks like, what that means now. So a lot of planning policy is towards building more houses, and one of the biggest reasons we need more houses because we live in smaller household units. Average household size in the UK was 2.4. It's down to 2.1. The biggest drive is that shrinks. Yes, we have some more people in the UK, but we're building like 1 million new houses a year, not to do with more people in the UK, to do with people living in smaller units, because people either want to live alone, they're getting divorced, families are breaking down, you don't live in extended families, and we don't build houses that are suitable for that. And so it's really hard to live together in extended family units. I am in London today, unusually, because I live in a little place close to my extended family, close to mum, close to everybody, so we can support and look after each other. It's part of our understanding of a good way to do housing. It's not the only way, but that allows us to do that. So I think it is a really important conversation to be had, and there's lots of different models that Christians have had: shared Christian living, different ways of doing things, living near each other so you can share even like lawnmowers and devices and things, or living in houses together where you do, right through to shared kitty living, like really radical ways of living that do speak counterculturally into what's happening.
Yeah, I think the issues around kind of stability and security and flourishing and the place of the house and the home to be a key part of that is really interesting. And I think it's something we should really care about. I think some of the challenges and a lot of the legislation is about trying to remove some of the burdens, some of the regulatory hurdles. And this is not just on housing, but also just bigger infrastructure projects. There was talk of a £100 million BAT tunnel that was involved in the development of HS2 because of all the regulatory burdens they had to do. Things just get really expensive and really complicated, and they're trying to trim that down. But Alicia alluded to some of the compulsory purchase things, increasing the powers of local authorities and developers to buy land. So here's my question. Would Jesus be a NIMBY or would he be a YIMBY?
Not in my backyard, or yes in my backyard. Oh, Danny. I mean, he'd nowhere to lay his head. So he doesn't have a backyard. He has, I don't have a backyard would be his answer.
Say, take my front yard as well.
Oh, Danny, it's good. It's good.
What do you think, Danny?
I think part of it is about sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's one of the issues people really, maybe it's a British thing particularly, But housing and personal identity, people hold very closely. And I think that's partly why people are very protective of their space. And on one side, we're saying houses are really important for personal security and family stability and community. And then, but I also think we have to say, well, what about those who don't have that? Actually, maybe if you're fortunate to have those things, that's great, but not everyone does. And where does sacrifice come in, and saying, well, actually, where do I need to have slightly less so others can have slightly more? And I think that's where I think NIMBYism is often short-sighted. I think it often is about protecting what you think you like and what you think you want. Often it's about aesthetics and things like that. I'm not saying aesthetics aren't important, but actually, are we saying that, well, someone else can suffer, someone else can have houses built in their village, but not in mine? I'm not sure that's the attitude we should take.
Isn't Danny married to an architect?
I am.
He is.
Just remembering that. You've got another stake in this conversation.
Yeah.
The aesthetics. I'd like to think the aesthetics are important to your life in house building.
I get a commentary when we drive past the States and new build developments.
Well, because Britain is pretty unusual. We have some of the highest levels of household ownership. So we're sitting at something in the 70% region. We are top of the table in that, if you like, whether that's good or bad. So in a place like Germany, household ownership is much less common. Renting, long-term renting is much more common. It's a very different mindset that we have. So we have to understand some of this is cultural. Yeah. And that doesn't, not necessarily good culture. It's just a British cultural mindset is to own land and houses. That's a way we think and process.
Yeah. And I think it's not necessarily about home ownership. And I think you could, whether it's long-term rental, I think there's questions to ensure that people do have some security in that. But ownership isn't necessarily the answer. You talked about the Jubilee reset. I think people can be sometimes overly protective of their assets and what they have. So I think a house ownership is a major feature in economic, personal stability and security. But I think sometimes we need to ask ourselves difficult questions around that.
I'm just thinking about two areas. So I live between two different places, one church family and one home with mum. And I think the challenge, the issue that I have with the house building projects currently in those two localities is that they're building at a rate, single use, maybe one or two, or if they're 3-bedroom, they're astronomical in terms of pricing, but there's nothing in the wider community that is established. Schools are not being built at the same space. So actually, it's an intention that if you wanted to start a family, actually there's then a pressure on schools. Public services aren't moving at the same pace. The level of what the high street looks like, I've got a personal bugbear, particularly with Barking. I am calling it out, and I've spoken to my local MP about it. There are too many gambling shops and there are too many fast food outlets that contribute to deprivation and poverty amongst a community that already have other health and social issues. We need to be building different types of infrastructure, stuff for young people, stuff for businesses, stuff for development, or it just needs to be a little bit more holistic. And at the moment, the vision I think the government have is to solve a problem of increase house building, but actually the community, unless you're living somewhere like King's Cross that has the development of everything from restaurants to the arts to everything else, things aren't being developed like that across the UK. And I think that's where I have a concern. And I think the church should also be leaning in and speaking into build houses, but build an infrastructure for family and community and for all of us to be a part of what is our home.
Yeah, well, in Jeremiah, when the kind of prophetic utterance in terms of being in Babylon was to build houses and live in them, but to plant your gardens and to marry and have kids. Like it was the whole, what does it look like to bed down? There was quite a simple summary there of what that kind of looked like. I think certainly one of the things we've lost is that kind of multi-generational living. We're not building houses that facilitate that easily. And that does tie us back to the assisted suicide conversation for some people. Some of that is the pressures of family life. So we move, we have geographical challenges around that. And then we have people who are saying, oh, well, my life's no longer useful. I'm a burden on my family. We don't know what to do. And so I think that ties some of our conversations together, along with the kind of radical rethink. What does the Bible have to say about this? It actually has loads to say. The Old Testament in particular, I think the Jubilee, Sabbath and gleaning laws are really interesting as we think about that. The gleaning laws were essentially the social security system. That's how it operated well there. And the Jubilee provided the reset. And the evidence is that it actually did work. For a long period, it did work. And then we see over a number of generations, it was working in the Old Testament. And then the kings came along and they joined field to field. And what was the big prophetic cry out? was you're not looking after the widow and the orphan. You're not respecting Sabbath and Jubilee. And they seem funny things to say, but the Sabbath was the small reset every week. And then Jubilee was that larger reset. So you'd weekly, then you'd add every 7 years, the Sabbath reset was a year in which you didn't plant. And part of that was also reliance on God. It was a faith moment. You actually didn't plant your fields. So you're like, I'm responsible for my family, but I don't plant my fields, because we go and see what grows kind of wild in that moment. And then the Jubilee, you returned land. And so it meant, again, there was a generational reset going on that we don't have in our society. And so people say, oh, I'm not sure the Bible's relevant today. Actually, there's loads of incredibly good stuff that would begin to frame a housing policy and begin to frame how we might look at infrastructure and some of these stories. So look, it's been a slightly mad and meandering episode from Love is Blind through assisted suicide, through gyms and who should or should not be allowed into gym spaces. And finally, Danny has maybe convinced us that housing and infrastructure was a worthy discussion, theologically rich discussion today. Thank you for joining us. Again, email, give us your feedback, rate, review, share this episode, and we will be back next week discussing who knows what, as we try and wrestle with how we navigate our Christian faith, our love of Jesus in this cultural moment. Be blessed.
Hi, Alicia here. Thank you for checking out this episode. If you like it, please make sure to subscribe or share with a friend and leave a review. Till the next episode, take care and God bless.